Greetings, my fearless frontliners, my fellow guardians of the galleries. I'm William Young, and this is the Just Corrections podcast. Today's topic is one that's absolutely crucial. It's critical in our line of work. Today, we're going to be talking about effective communication, and whether we realize it or not, the way that we talk, the way that we communicate with both the inmates and our coworkers can make or break our environment. And when it's done right, communication can reduce violence and increase the safety of our facilities. But before we get started, I want to take just a minute here, just a moment to thank the members of the Just Corrections Patreon community for supporting the podcast, for supporting the show. I love you, and I cannot thank you enough. And if you're listening, if you're watching, and you feel so moved, so inclined to support the show, then consider becoming a member, and I'll put the link in the description there below. Now, I know what you may be thinking, like, what does communication have to do with safety, right? Well, it absolutely everything, but you don't have to take my word for it, right? Who am I? I'm just no one from nowhere. But according to a study, right? You guys love studies published by the National Institute of Justice. Effective communication skills can play a significant role in de-escalating potentially violent situations with both inmates and fellow staff members. When we build rapport and communicate respectfully, we can create an environment where the tension decreases and understanding increases. You see what I did there with the little rhyme? Look, guys, I love communication. I've taken a ton of classes and read a ton about communication. So I figured I'd share a little bit of what I learned with you, specifically how can we be more effective communicators? And I'm going to use the concepts from a couple of different books, from two books I just read, two incredible sources: Nonviolent Communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, and How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And I'm going to put the links to both the books in the description or the show notes or wherever. They'll be somewhere. So let's start with nonviolent communication, or NVC for short. And at its core, NVC is about speaking from a place of empathy and understanding. And it encourages us, the book encourages us to focus on four main components. And it's observation, feelings, needs, and requests. So how in the world does this apply to a correctional setting? Well, instead of jumping to conclusions when something happens or someone starts reacting with aggression, NVC, nonviolent communication, encourages us to observe what's happening, look at what's happening without judgment. For example, if an inmate is acting out, he's kicking the door or screaming, instead of saying, "Yo, what's your problem, bro?" you might say something like, "Hey, Mr. Jones, I noticed that you're screaming and kicking on your door." And by saying what you actually see, by making a simple observation rather than a judgment, you avoid putting the other person on the defensive. And NVC also talks about, look, separating your observation of what's happening, right? What you actually see happening, and your interpretation of what's happening. And for me, this was huge, right? Because early in my career, when an inmate would start screaming or kicking or banging, I would instantly become annoyed. I would get pissed because I felt like their outburst was a direct reflection on my ability to run a housing unit, to do the job. So what nonviolent communication says here is that I have to separate it out, right? So what am I seeing? What is happening? The inmate is screaming and kicking on the door, and then look at, how am I feeling about the kicking and screaming? So we're seeing the door, we're seeing the inmate kicking on the door, we're hearing it, and then it pisses me off because I feel like that inmate is disrespecting me, and that I'm some sort of incompetent, terrible officer for having a disturbance in my unit. So the problem was that I would approach the interaction with my interpretation of what was happening instead of my observation of what was happening. Do you see that? Does that make sense? The inmate is screaming and kicking on the door. That's what's happening. He's not screaming and kicking on the door because he's angry at me personally. I mean, maybe, but there's probably something going on more than just that. So I approach it like that. I dig deeper. And now the next step that we have to do after we make our observation is we have to express our feelings. And this is a little weird, a little uncomfortable at first, especially in a correctional environment where we're trained to be tough. But but expressing how a situation affects us can be very, very powerful. And instead of reacting with anger and saying, bro, WTF are you doing? You could say something like, bro, when you scream and kick on the door, it concerns me and makes me wonder what's going on. Okay, maybe don't use bro, but use Mr. Jones instead. Now, the third component of NVC is about expressing our needs. And in corrections, this might be the need for respect, for cooperation, for safety. For example, you might say something like, I'd like to listen to you and see if I can help. But to do that, I need to be able to understand you. And it's difficult for me to do that if we're screaming. Do you see that? I'd like to help. I need to understand you. And I'm having trouble doing that if you're screaming. And then finally, we make a request, not a demand. So instead of saying, hey, bro, knock it off, you could ask, would you be willing to speak with me without screaming so I can see if I can help? Or something like, could you tell me what you need right now? Or how can I help you? This invites cooperation rather than resistance and gives the other person a chance to engage in a more positive manner. Now, I get it. You're probably thinking this sounds way too soft for a correctional environment. But here's the thing. Using nonviolent communication doesn't mean you're being weak or letting someone walk all over you. It means you're approaching situations from a place of clarity, of control, of empathy, which can diffuse tension and prevent situations from escalating into violence. We can still do the ask, tell, make thing. We're just adding a little more to the ask part. Before we dive into the next source that I'm talking about, Dale Carnegie's book, I want to talk about something that we don't always like to talk about or admit about how our job, the profession, and more specifically, how our training changes us. I mean, think about it. The skills that we learn in corrections are all absolutely necessary, right? They keep us safe, help us manage the chaos and protect those around us. But that same training, right, it can also change the way that we see the world, the way we connect with others, and even the way that we live our lives. And that's why my new book, this book right here, Trained to Change, the unfortunate and unintentional consequences of the correctional curriculum, that's what it's all about. It's not just about the job. It's about how the job changes us, how it impacts you. So if you've ever felt like work life is bleeding into your personal life in ways that you didn't expect, or you know somebody in the field who's struggling with that balance, then this book will help. This book might help. It's real, it's honest, and I wrote it from the inside for the inside with you in mind. So check it out, Trained to Change. It's available now today on Amazon. I'll put the link in the description. Give it a look and let me know what you think. Guys, I'm excited about this one because it's a little different from my other books in the fact that at the end of each chapter, it gives you the opportunity to fill out your own story, to complete your own story, to review, to recap, to reflect, and to respond to the call to action that is in this book, which is to change the way that we look at wellness, that is to take back ownership of the way that we live our life, the way we train our people, so that we can have the existence that all of us who work inside, who works behind the walls and the wire of the world's correctional facilities deserve. So check it out again, Trained to Change, available on Amazon. Go get that. And we're back. So let's now switch gears to another great book, another great tool, another classic, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And although this book was written back in 1936, like 180 years ago, its principles, right, the things that it talks about, the message is timeless. And they apply just as much to corrections, to a correctional facility as they do to the rest of the world. And one of Carnegie's most fundamental ideas is that people want to feel important and valued. And this applies to everybody, guys. This applies to everyone from your fellow officers to the inmates that we supervise. And here's the secret, right? Here's the secret. And this is something that I would write down if I was watching this or listening to this and taking notes. When you genuinely listen to someone, when you remember their name or show appreciation for their efforts, you build rapport and trust. And trust, right, is one of the most powerful tools that we have in this line of work. Boom, there it is. Mic drop. Are you supposed to say mic drop or just drop the mic? I never mind. Look, for example, when you interact with the inmates, something as simple as just referring to them or remembering their names and using it during a conversation can shift the dynamic. Instead of seeing you as just another authority figure, as just another correctional officer, they may see you as someone who recognizes their humanity. And guess what? People who feel respected and valued are less likely to act out violently. People who you have a rapport with will kill you last. And for me, that's what it's all about. I remember one of the classes in the academy when I started my career, and they talked about being a hostage and how to be a hostage and how it's important to make yourself human, because it's harder for the hostage taker to kill you if they view you as human. And that has always stuck with me. So that's what I try to do. That's why I talk and I communicate and I build rapport to make myself seem more human. So when they start killing people, they'll kill me last. And another principle from Carnegie in this great book is to avoid criticizing, condemning, or complaining. And this is incredibly important in a correctional setting, because negativity, right, can escalate a situation very quickly. So instead of focusing on what somebody is doing wrong, what if we tried to highlight what they're doing right, or suggest like a constructive way forward? And again, it's about creating a dialogue rather than creating confrontation. So let me give you a quick story how I used effective communication and how effective communication can change the outcome of a potentially violent situation. So I was working one night and I had an inmate who I saw up, pacing, walking. He was visibly agitated, right? He was pacing back and forth. He was starting to yell, to raise his voice, and I could have immediately responded with authority and told him to calm down or lay down or face the consequences. But instead, I remembered and utilized some of these principles that we're talking about. And I went up to him and I said, "Hey, man, I see you're upset. What's going on? Can we talk?" And this simple approach, right? Acknowledging his feelings and offering to listen, it immediately, you could see it in his face, it immediately took the edge off the situation. He explained to me that he was a veteran and that he suffered from PTSD, and that the thunder and the lightning and the storms that were in the area was triggering him. And so I spoke with him at length about the ways that he coped with storms and loud noises on the outside. And then we came up with a plan together how to help him now that he was incarcerated. So by taking some time, by listening to him, I was able to de-escalate him and peacefully, right, resolve the situation. We were able to have a calm conversation that ended with a resolution rather than a confrontation. And that's the power. I've got 100 examples. And that's the power of effective communication, right? It's not about being passive. I was still the authority figure there. It's about being proactive. It's about recognizing that the way that we talk to others has power. It has the potential to either escalate a situation or to bring it down, to lower it, to make it a manageable level. So before we wrap up, before I send you out into the world to your shift with these new tools, here are a few actionable tips, right, to improve your communication skills in your facility, in our correctional settings. Number one, listen more than you speak. People feel valued when they're heard. Sometimes just letting somebody blow off some steam, letting someone express themselves can de-escalate a situation. When I go negotiate or I go speak with somebody in crisis, I do very little talking. They do most of the talking. Number two, use empathy statements. Phrases like "I hear you" or "that sounds tough" can make the other person feel seen and respected. Don't tell somebody you understand, because you don't. But that's our go-to, right? An automatic response. I once heard an officer tell an inmate that just watched their child testify against them that they understood what they were going through. WTF? The inmate, right, had just said that they wanted to die, to kill themselves, and the officer that understood all of a sudden beat feet and ran to the office to call medical, right? Pull our policy. So the inmate says the magic words, and then we strip them down and throw them in a dark room and feed them bologna sandwiches until mental health gets around to assessing them, right? That's our answer. And it's funny. So when the officer was on the phone, the officer that understood went to the phone to call medical. I pulled up a chair and I started talking. I started speaking with the individual and asking them some questions. And then I started listening to what they were saying. And I could hear, so I'm having this conversation here, and then behind me in the office about 10 feet away, I could hear the officer talking to medical, and he's like, I don't know why the person's upset. I don't know why the person wants to kill themselves. But you know what? You know why they didn't know? Because they just said that they understood. And as soon as they heard that magic words, they beat feet and went and made a phone call. But I, within a minute and a half, had the story. I knew what was going on and what was going through their mind because I took the time to listen. Number 3, choose your words carefully. Avoid language that sounds like a demand or a threat, but instead use language that invites cooperation. Say please and thank you. Everybody knows that you're in charge. You don't have to talk like an ass. Number 4, be genuine and sincere. People can sense when you're being fake, and being authentic, right? Being sincere builds rapport and helps establish trust. And number 5, stay calm. Your tone and your body language can be just as important, if not more important, than the words that you use. Keeping your voice steady and your body relaxed helps convey, right, that you're in control and that you're not a threat. Look, effective communication is a skill that can transform your interactions in a correctional setting. It's not just about, guys, look, it's not just about getting through the day. It's about creating a safer, more respectful environment for everyone. And by applying the principles from these various sources like Nonviolent Communication and How to Win Friends and Influence People, right, these 2 books, you can reduce tension, you could build rapport, and ultimately reduce the violence within your facility. Folks, thank you for joining me today on the Just Corrections podcast. If you liked this episode, if you found value in this episode, then tell somebody, share it with your colleagues, your coworkers, subscribe, and join us next time as we continue to tackle these challenges, these hot button issues, the things that weigh heavy on our hearts that we face every day in corrections. All right, guys, that's all I got. Until next time, be smart, stay safe, stay sane, and we'll talk soon.